Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 119. The core idea, the core conceit of this class is that the study of modern American consumer culture is the study of modern American history. That when you focus, as we are in this class, on the development of a consumer culture over the last 150, 160 years, the larger story of American history is revealed. A focus on consumer culture reveals the broader trends in American economics, politics, society, and culture. Hopefully at this point in the class, after a few lectures, you've already seen that. When we examine consumer culture, we see the broader history of America in the Gilded Age, in the Progressive Era, and most recently in the 1920s. Here in this lecture, I hope to further that idea, that theme in the class, by talking about how consumerism helps us understand one of the key events in modern American history, the Great Depression. As we'll see in this lecture, when you focus on the element of consumerism in the 1930s, amidst this Great Depression, you have a way of understanding the larger impact, significance, and meaning of the Great Depression and the response to it, the New Deal. That is our focus in this lecture. In our most recent lectures, we talked about the 1920s and the ways in which there was great enthusiasm for consumerism, materialism, a good life at hand after the tumult, traumas of the Progressive Era and World War I. Americans in the 1920s found meaning in their lives through stuff, to such an extent that they often came to worship the businessmen who provided those gadgets and gizmos of the 1920s booming, roaring economy, the businessmen who provided the comforts and pleasure that was associated with a good life defined by goods so accessible. But at the end of the 1920s, that booming, roaring economy will come to a screeching halt and usher in one of the great disasters in modern American history, the Great Depression, and with it will come a great change, not just in the consumer culture, but the broader culture of America. Let's begin with a quick overview of the Depression itself. In October of 1929, the stock market would crash, and soon after, America would begin a slow descent into the greatest economic disaster in our history, at least for now. Stay tuned, right? As we may ourselves be living through the greatest economic disaster in our nation's history as a result of the COVID panic. But that takes a little bit of hindsight to see. We'll have to see in the months, years ahead, whether or not our current crisis will eclipse the Great Depression. So we'll offer a caveat here that for now at least, the Great Depression still stands as the greatest economic disaster in our history. When the stock market crashes, it isn't an instant descent into the Great Depression. It took a little bit of time for the full ramifications to ripple through the economy, and there is some scholarly debate about the connection between the stock market crash and the Great Depression. It's a scholarly debate that continues to this day, but a way to summarize this question of what's going on in the economy and how do we lead to a Great Depression is that the overheated and false economy of the 1920s was just unsustainable. As we talked about in the final slide of our most recent lecture, a lot of what appears to be on the surface a booming, roaring economy is really built on a glass shelf that would come crashing down by the late 20s. A lot of the booming, roaring economy was based on debt. It was based on borrowing. In the mantra of industrial freedom that prevailed through the Republican administrations of the 1920s, there was this emphasis on deregulation, on relaxing regulations that had been imposed during the Progressive Era. Free the businessmen from onerous regulations and we'll all benefit. That was the ideal of industrial freedom. Well, when the banking, finance, real estate industries were deregulated, it led to a lot of speculation, a lot of borrowing, a lot of malfeasance and poor corporate management, illegality, and all of this again came to a screeching halt by the late 20s. So the overheated, speculative, false, smoke and mirrors economy that seemed to offer prosperity in the mid-20s ultimately became unstable and unsustainable by the late 20s. And the stock market crash is part of that. People borrowed money to buy stock, speculating that the stock will rise, they'll be able to pay off their debts. Well, when the stock market crashed, that became impossible. People found themselves mired in debt with worthless stock. Before the stock market crashed, the overheated speculative economy in real estate burst in areas of development like Southern California and Florida, where there was this wave of suburbanization where people were borrowing money to build homes that they believed there would always be a market for. Well, that market became oversaturated. There wasn't always another line of buyers ready to buy a house in the suburbs. And so a lot of speculation, a lot of debt, and then later a collapse in prices and a declining market base for that housing meant that even before the stock market crash, there were signs of a diseased and flawed economy. And then the effects compound like ripples in a pond. When certain segments of the economy collapse, the effects are far-reaching, and by the early 1930s, you have some of the markers of the Great Depression beginning to manifest: high unemployment, factories closing. When people are laid off and factories close, those people can no longer buy. One of the ways to think about how consumerism, consumer culture relates to the Great Depression is that it was very clear by the early 30s, when these markers of the Great Depression begin to manifest, that our economy was dependent on consumerism. We had a consumer-based economy. It was based on people spending money, and that works well in the booming, roaring economy of the 1920s, but when people are laid off, when people have no money to buy things, well, the weakness of an economy centered on consumerism is baldly exposed. And so one connection we can already develop in regards to consumerism and the Great Depression was that the Great Depression magnified the way in which we are so dependent on consumerism. As we'll soon see, the New Deal, the response to the Great Depression, was about putting people back to work, putting money in people's pockets so they could spend again, because consumerism was so vital to our economy. It had to be revitalized. So when the Great Depression begins to really develop, people are laid off, they can't buy things, and the effects again are far-reaching. People can't pay their mortgage, people lose their homes, you have widespread foreclosures, you have massive deflation, a precipitous drop in the price of consumer goods. Now you might say, hey, that's great, everything's cheaper, right? No. Massive deflation, a decline in prices, is just as bad as massive inflation, a rise in prices. Massive deflation is a sign of a diseased, flawed economy that retards investment and employment. If you are, let's say, in the phonograph business and you're making phonographs, and you know that every day going forward you have to charge less and less for your phonograph as the only way to sell it in a diseased, flawed economy, well, you're going to make less phonographs because it's less profitable to sell them at a lower price. And eventually you're going to get to a point where it doesn't make sense to make them at all because you're not making any profit. And so you close your factory, you lay off your workforce, and then they can't buy things. So massive deflation, a huge decline in prices, is again a sign of a diseased, flawed economy that resists investment, retards development, and makes the economic misery indeed compounded. Some statistics to bear this out. 1932 is the nadir of the Great Depression, the worst of it, the worst year of what, at least for now, still stands as the greatest economic disaster in our history. It would also be the year that the sitting president, Herbert Hoover, would have to run for re-election. And it's part of the reason why Hoover will lose in a landslide. He ran for re-election during the worst year in our economic history. It was tough for him to argue for 4 more years. In 1932, you had 25% unemployment, 1 in 4 Americans completely out of work. And in 1932, there was no such thing as unemployment insurance. It's one of the things that was developed in response to the Great Depression, one of the things that has buffered us from having another Great Depression. We are right now in the midst of a very serious economic crisis, But one of the things that's helping people through this crisis is unemployment insurance, that today if you lose your job owing to the pandemic, there's still money coming in to keep the lights on, to buy groceries, to pay the rent. In 1932, unemployment insurance is not available to most Americans. And so 1 in 4 Americans have no source of income in 1932. The 75% who look like they're on the good side of this calculus, the good side of this equation, may only be working 1 or 2 days a week, because in 1932, if you worked 1 or 2 days a week, you were considered employed. You're not among the 25% here who have no source of income. Well, if you're working 1 or 2 days a week, you're not earning enough to pay the rent, buy groceries, keep the lights on. So the 25% unemployment figure here is sobering and startling, but it really only scratches the surface of economic misery, because yeah, you might be working 1 or 2 days a week and not among that 25% figure, but that meant you were only working 1 or 2 days a week. Massive deflation, drops in prices. We talked about how that is a sign in and of itself of a troubled economy, but also a force that makes manufacturers disinclined to produce goods and employ workers to do so. The gross national product, the collective value of all goods produced in this country, fell by a third by 1932. It was roughly about 100 billion in 1929, the zenith of the booming, roaring economy before the stock market crashed. But by 1932, the U.S. economy had lost more than $40 billion. So it dropped dramatically. Just some statistics here that really speak to the economic misery of this moment. So, the Great Depression, this great debilitating economic disaster, it magnified the extent to which we were dependent on consumerism. When people didn't have money to spend, the economic misery compounded. That's one of the reasons why between 1929 and 1932, the Great Depression is increasingly taking this terrible turn as things get worse in the aftermath of the stock market crash and certain segments of the American economy collapsing. When people didn't have money to spend, things got worse. And so one way to think about the relationship between consumerism and the Great Depression is that it really revealed what we had become through the Gilded Age progressive era 1920s, a consumer economy. But another way, as we'll see, to really, again, fit with the overall thesis and argument of this class, that the history of consumerism is the story of America writ large, when we turn our attention soon to the response to the Great Depression, the New Deal, you'll see that Roosevelt and the other figures behind the New Deal keenly understood this, that the way to revive the economy was to allow people to spend again. And so consumerism would be where Americans felt the pain of the Great Depression, but it would also be the focus of the effort to ameliorate that pain and revitalize the American economy. It's hard to overstate the true misery and deprivation of the Great Depression. People stood in bread lines. Long bread lines snaked through American cities. In the heart of industrial capitalism, New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, you saw these lines of desperate men huddled together, seeking sustenance. Again, this is sadly, tragically more relatable for us now, because we've seen similar but different examples today, where people are in these long lines now in their cars, having to socially distance, for food banks and other forms of relief in the current economic crisis. 1930s, pandemic, viruses weren't a concern, so you had miles and miles of people huddled together seeking bread, charity, so that they could feed their families. People who lost their homes due to foreclosures, people who were evicted from their apartments, found themselves in 1930s America, in the wealthiest country on earth, living in Hoovervilles. Hoovervilles were shanty towns that sprang up in vacant lots around the country, where people created roughly hewn dwellings made of spare lumber and aluminum, and they lived out in the elements in these shanty towns in the wealthiest nation on earth, with no electricity, no running water, no heat. They lived in these communities, these shanty towns, as they lost their homes. And they dubbed these communities Hoovervilles. Herbert Hoover was elected in 1928. He's the last of that string of Republican presidents of the 1920s who embraced the idea of industrial freedom. He ran in 1928 largely based on his reputation as a wealthy businessman, and that makes sense as we think about the culture of consumerism in the 1920s and its reverence for businessmen and the wealthy. It makes sense that Americans look to a businessman to lead their nation. Hoover wins in 1928. He was sworn in early 1929, and in his inaugural address, he said, quote, "Our future is bright with hope." And when he said those words, they were hardly controversial. Most Americans agreed. They had lived through this period through the 1920s where America was enjoying a booming, roaring economy, benefiting from the way in which World War I decimated our competitors in Europe, and enjoying expanded consumerist opportunities. Our future was bright with hope seemed to be an obvious observation of the time. But a few months later, the stock market crashes. And such a phrase, such a remark would come to haunt Hoover as his time in office would be consumed by this great crisis. Now, many Americans perceived Hoover as callous or indifferent to their sufferings. And so when they lost their homes, when they lost their apartments, when they found themselves now living out in the elements in the shanty towns, they dubbed those shanty towns Hoovervilles as a jab at the man who they saw as responsible for the crisis, and many who saw as indifferent to their suffering. So true deprivation, true hunger in a nation that had just few years earlier come to assume that we lived in boundless prosperity. One of the things to keep in mind here about this transition to now a very different America of the Great Depression is that it's a very breakneck transition. It's a 180. In our most recent lectures, we testified to the booming, roaring economy where you could, with little money, a little down payment, have what you want when you wanted it. Americans were enjoying the booming, roaring economy. And many Americans became convinced that this was now the ideal, that we would all live in this fashion of boundless abundance. And then this happens. A remarkable and abrupt shift to a very different America of widespread hunger and deprivation. And again, there is very little of what we would recognize as the minimum safety net we have today in 1932. No unemployment insurance, no Social Security, no such thing as welfare or other federal programs of immediate cash relief, no public housing programs to help people stay in their homes with subsidized rent. One of the big responses to the Great Depression was to create the minimal safety net that we have today, but it didn't exist in 1931, 1932, even in 1933, in the first few months of the Roosevelt administration. Again, as I said at the beginning of the slide, it's hard to overstate how terrible this was. Spikes in infant mortality as children don't live to their second birthday, owing to malnutrition and starvation. All the measurements of optimism for the future declined. The marriage rate dropped dramatically in the 1930s because people could not perceive being able to live as their parents had lived, be able to buy a house, raise a family. As the marriage rate dropped, so did the birth rate, and people became convinced that they would never raise a family. All the measurements of pessimism increase, including the highest suicide rate in American history. Now, you probably heard stories of businessmen killing themselves in the Great Depression because they were guilty of illegality and malfeasance, and they feared going to prison. Such stories are rare, and certainly the exception, because the vast majority of Americans who killed themselves in the Great Depression were working-class Americans who internalized a shame, blaming themselves for something that wasn't their fault, internalized a shame because they now could not care for their families. You can read through so many diaries, letters, public statements by working people in the 30s who say, I am worthless because my worth was based on my work, my employment, and my ability to care for my family. In a society that so rewarded work, labor, and saw it as central to one's identity, when that work goes away, people lost that sense of purpose, and many took the dramatic step of killing themselves as a result of internalizing that shame. People lived a rootless existence, traveling the country, desperate for work. You had an entire generation of Americans come of age in the Great Depression who didn't have a sense of home, a sense of rootedness, a sense of connection. Again, this seemed to be a cruel development after they had lived through that booming, roaring economy of the 1920s when it seemed like opportunity and abundance abounded. So there's the economic damage. There's the physical damage, and then there's the psychological damage where many Americans came to the belief that the American dream was a lie, that they had been lied to. And that's why in the 1930s, a lot of radical ideas start to take root in America. Communism, fascism. 1930s would be the era of the rise of Hitler, and there were prominent Americans going around the country praising Adolf Hitler, men like Charles Lindbergh, who would form a group in the 1930s and early 40s called America First. Where have we heard that more recently? Which argued for further isolationism and a urging to not confront Hitler, as Lindbergh admired Hitler and shared with him his revolting anti-Semitism. That's just one example of how people in this country were being urged to embrace a new radical way of organizing society, fascism, as it took root in Germany, in Italy, in Spain. Other Americans were drawn to communism and socialism. But as we'll see in this lecture, America doesn't go communist in the 1930s. America doesn't go fascist. Instead, as a result of the New Deal, we would become more committed than ever to consumerism and consumer capitalism. But when Americans were psychologically traumatized by this terrible event, many of them did entertain such radical ideologies. Related to this was a way in which anger manifested. Anger at the people who had been previously put on pedestals as idols, the wealthy, the businessmen. In the 1920s, you were urged to see businessmen as gods. We talked about Bruce Spartan's The Man Nobody Knows, where he saw Jesus Christ as a businessman. In the 1920s, Americans were urged to see businessmen as gods to worship and emulate, to see them as the most admirable people because they produced the gadgets and gizmos that undergirded identity and meaning in the 1920s. Well, in the 1930s, you get an about face in that way of regarding businessmen. Instead, now they're seen as devils, guilty of malfeasance. When Franklin Roosevelt runs for re-election in 1936, he launches a campaign designed to appeal to working-class Americans and rally them around his New Deal and the Democratic Party by deliberately targeting the wealthy as those responsible for the misery felt in America and urging them to support his effort to exact high tax rates on the wealthy. So I mentioned this in our most recent lectures, and here it is now in very clear terms. Through the history of the 20th century, in the period that we're now examining, as we examine modern American consumer culture, you see this ebb and flow in regards to American attitudes about business. In the Progressive era, suspicion, calls for regulation, and then in the 20s, industrial freedom and a sense of solidarity with big business. Great Depression would return us to Progressive era sensibilities, where Americans would now see businessmen not as architects of the good life, but those responsible for economic misery, and from that will come great broad support for taxing the rich and government intervention in the economy. And later on, as we go forward, we'll see the attitudes in America shift away from that more interventionist role. In the 1950s, there's another period of consumerism where Americans are more akin to feeling in league with big business. There's this fear of communism in the Cold War era, so anything involving government in the economy seems to reek of communism. But then in the 60s, as we'll see, there'll be another regulatory moment. And then again, it will bounce back in the 70s and 80s in a more conservative direction towards another version of industrial freedom. So we're really in a moment now in the class where we could see this vacillation, this ebb and flow. Great Depression, you see certainly a flow towards a more regulatory approach to big business as Americans marshal their anger at the people they felt responsible for their true deprivations and misery. If you look at the culture of the 1930s, as we'll talk about in this lecture, it's a celebration often of working people, of the little guy, of small town values, and an indictment of what are perceived as the false, ruinous values of the 1920s. Greed, individualism. In the 1930s, Americans stared into the abyss. They saw their nation at the brink of destruction. And they wondered, how the hell did we get to this? How did we come to this Great Depression? And in that dialogue with ourselves, we often came to the conclusion that we came to this abyss, we came to this moment because in the 1920s we were lured by false values of greed, materialism. We were told that the end-all be-all was a house in the suburbs and a car in the garage. And that will force a recalibration of values that again is part of a cultural jousting, a cultural argument that we can often see through our study of consumerism between whether or not a society focused on materialism is a society progressing, or whether or not such lavish devotion to shiny objects makes us unable to see what is truly good and noble. Well, in the Great Depression, people were very critical of the idea that slavish devotion to the latest gadget and gizmo is the way to find meaning, and instead they recalibrated their values as part of a cultural debate that again you can really see through the earnest and dedicated study of modern American consumer culture. And in this moment in that history, you certainly have a more critical vision of slavish devotion to consumer goods. In 1932, Herbert Hoover would have to run for re-election, owning the Great Depression. He was the guy in charge when everything went to hell. And he was often seen again as callous and indifferent to the sufferings of Americans or inept in his response to a crisis that was now so deep and severe. Opposing him in 1932 was the Democratic nominee. Now, as we've talked about, through the 1920s, the Republicans controlled the White House from Warren G. Harding through Calvin Coolidge and then Herbert Hoover. So the Democrats were eager to reclaim the White House, and they nominated in 1932 Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who ran and won in a landslide. And Roosevelt will be the president during the two crises of the early 20th century that are now our focus in the class. The first of those crises, the Great Depression, which we're examining in this lecture, and then in our next lecture we'll talk about the second crisis of the early 20th century, World War II. And through both crises, Roosevelt will be president. He'll be elected in 32, re-elected in 36, 40, and 44. This is before we amended the Constitution, stipulating that presidents can only serve 2 terms. Roosevelt's argument was we needed steady leadership through these crises. So Roosevelt's first elected in a landslide in 32, and he will ultimately be re-elected 3 times, and he only really stops being president when he dies in office in 1945. So a lot about Roosevelt as we examine these 2 crises now in the early 20th century. He came in with his New Deal. Now the New Deal was not sort of set and imagined and expressed and articulated and formulated when Roosevelt ran or even when he immediately took office. It sort of develops organically. But Roosevelt took office ready to do something, ready to intervene. And through that process, he would ultimately create what we know as the New Deal, a battery of programs that would reinvent the relationship between government and citizens, where government would now play a much more interventionist role in the economy and also seek to create economic stability through the establishment of a safety net that American consumers should never fall below. So we really are now at a moment where we have cleaved back to the more regulatory interventionist role for the federal government that we first saw in the progressive era, where there was a sense that American capitalism has failed. In the Gilded Age, you heard that from muckrakers who exposed the inequities of haves and have-nots. In the 1930s, that idea that capitalism has failed was very apparent in breadlines and Hoovervilles and massive unemployment. And so Roosevelt says the government needs to do something to address the immediate crisis in front of us. And as we'll see, as part of the New Deal, FDR will put people to work, put money in their pockets, urge them to build infrastructure projects that will not only employ people, put money in their pockets, money that they'll spend, but also rebuild the American economy by creating an infrastructure by which commerce can develop. But he'll also create programs like unemployment insurance, Social Security, that were designed for a larger vision of, again, economic security for the average American. So we have this moment returning us in many ways to the sensibilities of the progressive era, but even expanding upon them with an even more interventionist regulatory role for the government in employing people and creating that safety net, and with it a rejection of the idea that what's good for business is good for us all, and the deregulatory posturing of industrial freedom. Roosevelt will be president during these two crises, and his administrations will echo a larger sentiment of sacrifice and service, that our way forward through these crises, first the Great Depression and later World War II, will involve collective sacrifice, taxes, new regulatory measures by the government in the Great Depression, and then rationing and various forms of sacrifice in World War II. But the ethos of both of these eras, and certainly one articulated by Roosevelt, was the idea that we're all in this together. The Great Depression stung America, urban, rural, black, white, male, female, educated, and undereducated. World War II was a massive mobilization of the totality of America. So these concussive events and crises folded all Americans into a collective experience. And Roosevelt wanted us to be conscious of that we were all in this together, and that would involve sacrifices like new taxes to fund government programs, a more regulatory approach to the economy, rationing and other limits in the World War II era. But through that collective sacrifice also came opportunities as a collectivity, as a society, to rebound and rebuild America. So Roosevelt comes in 32, sworn in 33, and he gives arguably one of the most famous inaugural speeches in American history, arguing that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That we can conquer this. We can solve this riddle of the Great Depression. We've been through worse in our history. Civil War, where the very fate of the nation was at stake, and yet we endured and survived. And so we'll get through this too. So part of what Roosevelt had to do was recalibrate America's sensibilities towards the possible, offer them hope, assure them that this foe of the Great Depression could be vanquished. And he did it by a willingness to use the government in new ways that could provide immediate relief to Americans, put money in their pockets, put them to work, get them out of Hoovervilles and breadlines. And then also a larger vision that the government could do things, the government could be efficacious. Again, many Americans saw Hoover as indifferent, unwilling to do things that could really ameliorate the problems. Roosevelt was again coming into this period of great misery and deprivation where some Americans were entertaining radical new notions of communism, socialism, fascism, and he wanted to prove that the American system could work. It could solve problems, and it could create not just immediate relief, but a new America through his New Deal, where greater economic security was at hand for more and more Americans. A crisis was at hand, but it was a crisis we could solve. And in solving it, create a new foundation for economic security and prosperity going forward. So Roosevelt had a number of tasks in front of him as the New Deal began. Not just concrete measures that could ameliorate the immediate problems in front of us, but also a larger vision of hope and possibility during this dire moment in our nation's history. Let's now talk about the specifics of the New Deal. What did Roosevelt actually do, and how it reflects consumerism, a consumer economy and consumer culture. During the New Deal, Roosevelt created jobs programs that put Americans to work. They included the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which through the course of its lifetime would employ millions of Americans in a variety of different walks of life. And the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, also created early in the New Deal, even before the WPA, which also would employ millions of Americans. So the New Deal was marked by federal employment, direct federal employment, where through these various jobs programs, the federal government would be the direct employer of millions of Americans. This had never happened before in American history, unprecedented. The logic behind these jobs programs was if you could not find a job in the private sector, before you could be employed by the WPA or CCC, you had to prove that you actually went looking for a job in the private sector, because the federal government much preferred you working for General Electric, GM, or Hughes Aircraft. But if you couldn't find a job in the private sector because it's the Great Depression and factories are closed, you could find a job working for the government. This put people to work, put money in their pockets, money they would spend, money that would eventually ripple through the economy. Every dollar paid to CCC and WPA workers didn't stay in their pockets. It went into the broader economy, helping to spark relief. But the labor they performed was also imagined to be part of a broader rebuilding of America. They built roads, bridges, schools, hospitals. This is very demonstrative of that theme of sacrifice and service, as much as it is demonstrative of an effort to revitalize a consumer economy. Your government's going to serve you in new ways by offering you employment at a time of this great crisis. And then you, in turn, could serve your nation by adding to the physical wealth of this nation, building roads, bridges, airports, stadiums, schools, universities. So here's a good example of how the New Deal addressed the immediate crisis that Roosevelt inherited when he was sworn in 1933, 25% employment, 1 in 4 Americans without any work or source of income. Well, put Americans to work. Put them to work in these jobs programs. Pay them wages. And those wages will revive a flagging economy as people buy groceries and pay their rent. So what we have here is an effort to build economic relief through a consumer economy, recognizing that we had a consumer economy, recognizing that our economy was dependent on allowing people to spend. And if you couldn't find a job in the private sector, then you can find a job in the public sector here working for the WPA and CCC so that people did have money to spend. The WPA and CCC were involved in large-scale projects that rebuilt this nation and added to our physical wealth. We still drive on WPA roads. We still send our kids to WPA schools. We still benefit from an investment made 80 years ago. This has to be factored into how we measure the efficacy of the New Deal. Yeah, it was about an immediate crisis, but it was also about long-term wealth. And that long-term wealth was also geared towards reviving a consumer economy. They built roads and airports, the means for distributing and transporting goods around the nation. They built national parks that were part of a tourist industry. They built universities that would educate people and future generations who would find work, pay taxes. So again, so much of the labor performed was more than just putting people to work. It was about investing in the broader consumer economy. One element of the New Deal employment process was to build hydroelectric dams and string electric wires into parts of the rural South through the Tennessee Valley Authority, bringing electricity to parts of the United States that didn't have electricity even in the 1930s. Believe it or not, there are parts of the United States that in the 30s did not have electricity. Well, the building of hydroelectric dams that could generate electricity, the stringing of wires across great expanses of the rural South, electrified parts of America that had been closed to the modern experience. Once people had electricity in their homes, guess what they wanted? Vacuum cleaners, washing machines, radios, and later TVs. So again, this was an investment that put people to work, but it was also an investment that later bore fruit in the broader consumer economy. So jobs programs, Works Progress Administration, CCC, good examples of how the New Deal was really about consumerism, putting people to work, putting money in people's pockets, and then also building things that added to our collective wealth, created an infrastructure that allowed commerce to flow, and then facilitated other consumerist transactions. Another part of the New Deal was the FDIC, the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. One of the great crises of the Great Depression was a banking crisis. Banks collapsed. They closed. People lost their savings. There were runs on banks in the early 30s where people went to the bank demanding their money, withdrawing money out of a bank. And that's not really how banks work, right? I hope you know this by now. When you put your money in a bank, it doesn't sit there in a drawer or box somewhere waiting for you. The bank takes that money and invests it in the broader economy. And so when people ran to the bank demanding their life savings, it wasn't there. And that, of course, made them incredibly concerned and worried. So in the Hoover years, there was this great crisis in banking. And one of the elements that comes out of the New Deal is an effort to really stabilize and create what is the modern banking system in America. The Federal Reserve had been created in the Progressive era, but it really wasn't well developed or functional. It's really only since the New Deal that we've had a much more regulatory and stabilized banking system. And part of that was creation of the FDIC, where depositors were assured that their deposit up to a certain amount was insured by the federal government, meaning that if this bank goes belly up, if this bank closes, if this bank, for whatever reason, collapses, the federal government's going to guarantee your savings. This was all designed to get people to put their money back into banks so that banks could lend that money out to people who wanted to buy houses, buy cars, open factories, and revitalize the economy. Roosevelt and his fellow New Dealers realized that the only way to revive the economy was to get the banking system operational again. And that meant encouraging ordinary Americans to get the money out of their mattresses, where they might have hid it, or out of their backyard where they may have buried it, and back into a banking system that could create a more fluid economy where people could get loans if they wanted to buy things, where people could get loans if they wanted to open a factory to produce things. So in so many ways, again, this is about consumerism. It's the point I'm making throughout this lecture, that when you look at the New Deal, this cardinal, central, key development in modern American history, you see consumerism, whether it's the jobs programs or programs like this, FDIC, which were designed to, again, get people to deposit their money in banks again with this assurance, don't worry, you'll get your money back, because the federal government is insuring it. And once people were willing to deposit their money again, you could have, again, a more fluid economy where loans are available to do things like buy things or produce things. So this is a hallmark of the New Deal. It's one of the most important programs to come out of the New Deal. If your money's in a bank today, it's insured up to a certain amount. We may take this for granted, but it had to be created. It was created in the New Deal in a way that recognized the necessity of having a consumer-based response to a consumer-based economy. Unemployment insurance is created so that people who lose their jobs have a source of income so they can continue to participate in a consumer economy. This is something we can really be keenly, sharply aware of, because the current crisis we're going through right now, one of the things that's made it less catastrophic than it already is the expanded unemployment insurance that came out of the CARES Act passed early in the COVID crisis, where people got more unemployment income so that they could continue to not only pay the rent and pay groceries, but to participate in the consumer economy. Well, unemployment insurance didn't exist in the 30s until it was created under the New Deal, and it's had that effect of providing people stability, security. It's part of that larger vision of the New Deal of a safety net, a minimum standard of living that no one should fall below, but it's also clear recognition that the way to that stability is by allowing people to buy things in a consumer-based economy. In 1935, Congress passes and Roosevelt signs into law the Social Security Act. And maybe this is the best example of how the New Deal affects all of us. Social Security today is a mainstay of American life. It is the most popular program the federal government administers. Even the most ardent conservatives support Social Security. Came out of the New Deal. It taxed existing workers through a payroll tax. So if you're employed, as I imagine most of you are, you pay a payroll tax. That money comes out of your check to support people who can no longer work, the elderly, the disabled, through Social Security. So it involves sacrifice. We all make that sacrifice. But it also involves service. You're serving people who can no longer work. It's very much about reciprocity, mutuality. We're all in this together. We all must be part of the solution. Right now, you're employed and you're paying that tax. You're sacrificing. You're serving others. But in the true, fully fleshed out elements of collectivity and mutuality, you know that someday when you're no longer able to work, someone will be supporting you. I hate to break it to you. You're so young and vigorous, young college students, your whole life ahead of you, but you're going to get old someday. It happens to all of us. And when you're old and unable to work, well, someone will be taxed to support you. So there's so many ways in which Social Security crackles with notions of sacrifice, service, mutuality, reciprocity. But perhaps the best way to understand Social Security is as a consumerist program. What Social Security does is it allows people who wouldn't be able to buy things to do so. What it does is it allows non-wage earning Americans to still participate in the consumer economy. It puts money in the pockets of people who wouldn't be able to spend that money but are now able to do so. Social Security is often, again, seen as a form of retirement. It's seen as a way of, again, supporting people who can no longer work. But really, it's a consumerist program. It's about giving people a chance to spend if they wouldn't been able to do so. It's had a huge impact. Prior to the creation of Social Security, the demographic group in America that had the highest rates of poverty, the elderly. Prior to Social Security, your last few years for most Americans were pretty miserable. You either worked to your dying day, because you had to. There's no such thing as retirement for most Americans. Again, leisure was the province of the rich. Or if you could not work, you were burdened to your family, who themselves may already be impoverished or on the margins. So prior to Social Security, the life of the elderly in working class America, pretty miserable. And they had very high, the highest rates of poverty. Since Social Security, today, the demographic group in America that has the lowest rates of poverty, the elderly. So it's had a huge impact in, again, getting money into the pockets of people who wouldn't have had that opportunity. Another New Deal program that represents consumerism, a consumer-oriented response to a consumer crisis, FHA, Federal Housing Authority, which offered a federal guarantee to banks issuing mortgages. So it's a lot like FDIC, where a bank may grant you a mortgage, and they're more inclined to do that because they have this assurance from the FHA that if the borrower defaults on that mortgage, the bank will get its money back. It is a federal guarantee, which meant that banks would be more likely to lend money out to people. It offered low down payment, low interest loans, so people with modest savings could buy a home. It allowed people to buy a home engage in that act of consumerism. But then, of course, as we've learned, once you buy a home, it only connects you to a wider network of consumerist activities, buying furniture, buying a car, buying all of those things that go along with home ownership. So again, it's very demonstrative of the New Deal, seeing economic revitalization as really forced forward through consumerism. Allow people to buy, and when they buy, the effects of that are far-reaching ripples in the pond. Buy a house, and the effects of that reach well beyond that one particular transaction. So you have the Federal Housing Authority, which was designed to shore up that industry. We've shored up the banking industry. Let's shore up the housing industry that was so decimated by the Great Depression. Let's allow people to buy houses again by offering them low down payment, low interest loans guaranteed by the federal government. Encourage banks to lend money. And not only does that, again, sell a house, but it opens the door to a wide array of other consumerist activities, as when you buy a house, you buy furniture, you buy a lawnmower, you buy all the things associated with it. So you have the Federal Housing Authority, which would serve to really buoy the real estate industry and encourage people to buy again. The economic effects of these efforts are clear, but again, they also had psychological effects. We learned in our most recent lecture that the home, your house, in the 1920s, was increasingly a part of your identity. It was where you lived, but also where you expressed yourself. It was a marker of achievement, the American dream, one that was increasingly available to more and more Americans. Well, the Great Depression shattered that dream, and many became convinced again they would never own a home, raise a family. The Great Depression gave people a sense of rootlessness, an itinerant existence where they desperately traveled the country seeking work, confident that they would never buy a home. So, just like the car isn't just a car, the home wasn't just a home. It was freighted and loaded with all kinds of cultural and social meanings. It was a marker of the American dream. It was a marker of stability. It was a marker of identity and individuality. And the New Deal recognized that. We got to get people to buy houses again, not only because it will buoy the economy, but it will buoy the collective spirits of a disillusioned and despondent America. Faith. Faith in the American system and the American way. And the American way is so defined by real estate, by the home. Quick note, though, about these programs. I've been stressing to you that they very much represent a sense of us, a sense of collectivity. We're all in this together. We all must be part of the solution. But sadly, tragically, the New Deal was exclusionary along racial lines. When Social Security was first created, it was designed to exclude many African Americans because certain jobs, like domestic labor, working as a domestic, as a housekeeper, or certain trades where there was a high percentage of African American workers, were excluded from Social Security. They didn't receive any benefits. So Social Security, created in the 1930s, seemingly was about us, a collective security, a collective sacrifice, but it was deliberately written to exclude African Americans who would not receive those benefits. Federal Housing Authority was complicit in residential segregation and residential discrimination. Black borrowers could not get those low down payment, low interest loans. Banks who enjoy the protection of the FHA refused to loan money to African American borrowers or other Americans of color. What these programs did was further the racial wealth gap. What they did was they furthered the divide between white America and its ability to enjoy these programs that are designed to offer opportunity, and those Americans who were outside that veil of opportunity. This, too, is a way in which we can look at the New Deal and consumerism as so indicative of the broader trends of American history, where, with the development of a consumer economy, so many were excluded from its pleasures, comforts, and access to the American dream defined through that consumerism. The New Deal wasn't for everyone. It wasn't a moment to offer relief to all Americans. In fact, many of the programs created were deliberately exclusionary in this fashion. So the New Deal must come with caveats. The New Deal must come with a recognition of who was included and who remained excluded. In most periods of American economic depressions, collapse, recessions, labor unions get weaker, not stronger. But the New Deal is the exception to that, because during the Great Depression, labor unions actually got stronger. Landmark labor legislation was passed in the 1930s designed to shore up labor unions. There were a number of strikes, another flare of labor violence in America in the early 30s amidst the Great Depression, anywhere from the industrial heart of America to agriculture. Here in the Southwest, there were major confrontations between farm workers, many of them Latino or Asian American, Filipino American, and the billionaire growers who controlled agribusiness. There were massive strikes in Orange County and then in the Empire, in the Imperial Valley, deadly, brutal strikes that were suppressed. So you had labor unrest in so many segments of the American economy. Roosevelt responded to that in an effort to help shore up labor unions. He passed and signed into law the Wagner Act that recognized the right of unions to form, that workers had a right to form unions, created the National Labor Relations Board. But the problem here with labor unions, again, is one of exclusion because so many labor unions refuse to have African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, also religious minorities in those unions, and it was perfectly legal for them to discriminate. So it was a time of greater support for labor unions, but that too came with, again, an exclusionary element. Later in the class, when we talk about the efforts of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta in the 60s and 70s to unionize Latino and Asian American farm workers, the reason why Chavez and Huerta have to make that fight decades later is because labor unions had been so exclusionary, refusing to include people of color and religious minorities in the membership into their unions. So labor unions got stronger. They were able to secure better working conditions, higher wages through things like the Wagner Act and the National Labor Relations Board. But you had to be a member of a labor union to enjoy those benefits. And so many people of color, women, and racial and religious minorities were excluded. So the New Deal, again, complicated beast. By the late 30s, the effects of the New Deal were increasingly seen, and some parts of the American economy began to rebound. There were signs of relief, and those signs of relief, again, can be best measured in the consumer economy. So the New Deal was about targeting consumerism, and its effects can also be seen in the consumerist realm. Further evidence of how, again, when you look at consumerism, you see the broader story of America, in this case, the story of the New Deal. If consumerism is where the pain of the Great Depression would be felt, people losing their homes, losing their jobs, unable to buy, consumerism would also be where relief would be found. By the late 30s, you see rebounding elements of the American economy. Sales of refrigerators and radios rebounding and rising, these markers of, again, the good life. There's very little in terms of new car sales, but Americans held on to their cars in the 1930s, increasingly depended on their cars. We became a more car-centered America in the 1920s. People could not afford necessarily to buy a new car in the 30s, but they continued to hold on to their cars and maintain those cars, helping to maintain an oil industry as gas sales began to rise when the economy rebounded. Banks, now with greater support from the federal government, greater legibility. Again, regulation doesn't retard economic development, often facilitates it. When the federal government comes in and regulates the banking industry with an eye for stability, well, banks benefit. And they felt as if they had an ally in the federal government that was trying to work in concert with them to encourage borrowing, lending, the things that make for a more fluid economy. And that meant by the mid-30s, they're loaning out money in mortgages and other forms of credit. So again, necessary to a consumer economy. If you want to spend, you got to be able to borrow, to buy a car, to buy a house, to buy things that, again, you could not pay for in cash. And so with expanded credit, with greater fluidity in the finance sectors, banking sectors of the economy, more Americans could again borrow and enjoy those markers of the good life defined through consumerism. So by the mid to late 30s, once again, Americans are borrowing money, and that seemed to indicate a revitalization, a buoyed confidence. Part of what Roosevelt had to pull off was to make you want to borrow again, to be willing to take that risk, to buoy again the confidence of Americans at a time of great crisis. And that's starting to manifest by the mid to late 30s, when the effects of the New Deal were beginning to be felt. He put people to work, put money in people's pockets. He sought to shore up the banking, real estate, housing industries in America, and people began to feel a little bit more confident, particularly in urban areas. Another fault or fracture of the New Deal concerned rural America. Things actually got worse, not better, in many parts of rural America because of a simultaneous economic disaster, the Great Depression, and an ecological disaster, the Dust Bowl, the droughts of the Midwest and Plains region. But in urban areas, in industrial America, there seemed to be hope anew for, again, the Americans who could access those New Deal relief programs, which, as we talked about at the end of our previous slide, remained so exclusionary along the lines of race. But for white Americans, there was a chance. And you could see that here in statistics, where there are these acts of consumerism that are increasing. People taking out loans, people buying things on credit, people vacationing, motoring. So there were signs of a revitalization of the American economy by the late 30s as a result of a New Deal targeting a consumer economy. That consumer economy responded. And that's what I mean here about how the focus of relief would be consumerism, and the markers of relief would be about consumerism. The New Deal recognized that if we're going to revitalize the economy, we have to help people spend money. And then when people began to spend money, it seemed like, again, there was at least some chance of return to a normal American economy. By 1935, people are once again taking vacations. They are driving those cars. The sale of gasoline is increasing. They're going to the expanded recreation opportunities that came with WPA projects that revitalized national parks or opened new tourist attractions around the country. So the New Deal targeted consumerism by putting money in people's pockets, offering them different forms of economic relief, shoring up industries that facilitated a revitalization, and the American people responded. And again, you have to understand that the effects of this are both economic and psychological. They're about restoring hope, demonstrating that government could do something, that the American system does work. At a time where many Americans were despondent, disillusioned, at a time in which many Americans became convinced that capitalism had failed and new systems of human governance were necessary, communism, fascism. So there is the economic effect that to some extent can be measured in statistics, some of them offered here in the slide, but economics is never just about economics. It's also psychological. You have to urge people to believe. You have to urge people to trust. You have to urge people to spend. And the New Deal, in the way in which it targeted a consumer economy, was designed to meet that other crisis, the psychological crisis, as well. So we have here some markers of hope that indeed the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Some of the other effects of the New Deal on American consumer culture can be found in the way in which the crisis sparked a larger cultural debate. As I mentioned earlier, Americans in the throes of the Great Depression wondered aloud whether or not the American dream had turned out to be a lie, whether or not the American system was inherently corrupt and irredeemable. We were staring into the abyss, and from it came this larger cultural discussion about how we came to this moment and how to revitalize an American dream that seemed to be slipping away. With that came a critique of what many saw as the false values that brought us to this crisis: greed, individualism, materialism, consumerism, the adoration of the new, the rejection of the old and the traditional. 1920, as we talked about, was an age that celebrated consumerism, materialism, where Americans were urged to worship the rich, feel in league with and solidarity with businessmen. It was one that prized modernity, the new, the novel, and often rejected older traditions. But in the Great Depression, you'd see a revitalization of what was imagined to be the traditional values of America, a critique of materialism and wealth, and a veneration of common values, the culture of the common individual, and an embrace of American institutions and emblems of the American way. In the WPA, musicologists like Alan Lomax were funded. WPA did not just employ people to build bridges and roads. It truly was a holistic approach to American labor and employed people in a variety of different forms of labor, including musicologists through the WPA Federal Music Project, who would record the music of the people, folk music, the blues, bluegrass. Alan Lomax traveled to the Stovall plantation in Mississippi and captured the very first recordings of a man who will later move to Chicago, electrify the blues, create the sound we know as rock and roll. Muddy Waters. The very first recordings of Muddy Waters were captured on a primitive machine located in the trunk of Alan Lomax's car when he traveled to the Stovall plantation in Mississippi. Lomax was employed by the WPA, an example of how the WPA employed people not only to build bridges, but also to capture what was imagined to be the public wealth of America found in the music of common people like sharecroppers, like McKinley Morganfield, later known as Muddy Waters. There was a WPA arts project that funded murals that often represented working people in nobility, in honor. If you've ever been to San Francisco, there is a building, a tower that overlooks that beautiful city, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, let alone the nation. As you ascend the staircases inside Coit Tower to get that great view of San Francisco, along the way is a mural painted by WPA muralists during the 1930s. It's just another example of how we are surrounded by public wealth that we still enjoy here 80 years after the New Deal. The mural in Coit Tower, painted by muralists that still stands to this day, is an ode to working people. It doesn't celebrate the rich businessmen. It doesn't celebrate machines. It celebrates farmers, laborers, common people. WPA, people were hired in a variety of walks of life. It employed people in construction and heavy blue-collar labor, but it did employ people in the arts, photographers like Dorothea Lange, who captured so many of the key images of the Great Depression, musicologists like Alan Lomax, muralists who will paint murals around the country. The WPA was an effort to employ people in all walks of life because all Americans faced the pain of the Great Depression. It was this idea that everyone has a labor to contribute, white collar, blue collar. It employed even the most worthless people of all, the people who contribute nothing to American society. That's right, historians. Even us, we were employed by the WPA to capture local histories, to capture the histories of small towns that may be lost and neglected. WPA historians were hired to go to the South and interview the last generation of Americans who had been born into slavery. And from that came the WPA slave narratives, a great window into the experience of slavery that would have been lost to us if we didn't make that investment. The WPA in all of these efforts, murals in Coit Tower, folk music, was turning its focus to, again, the cultural traditions and histories of working class Americans, the salt of the earth, people who had often been, again, ignored and neglected in the 1920s that celebrated celebrity, celebrated wealth, celebrated modernity. If the 1920s was the jazz age, a modern, urban sound, 1930s was a era that celebrated folk music, the blues, bluegrass, and country, the music of the people. John Steinbeck also offers us a great window into the Great Depression with a battery of novels he wrote in the 1930s, Cannery Row, Grapes of Wrath, Tortilla Flat, all of which document the experience of people who are often unseen in the 1920s that focused on wealth, itinerant farmers, immigrants, people displaced by the Dust Bowl and the ravages of the Great Depression. Steinbeck's novels are fiction, but as so often is the case, fiction often is better able to communicate the truth than non-fiction. I know, after many, many years now of grading undergraduate work, that far too many of you believe that any book with more than 10 pages and no pictures is a novel. But I hate to break it to you, not every book is a novel. The books you will read in history class, an autobiography, a biography, those are nonfiction. They're based on what actually happened. Fiction is created by the novelist's imagination. And in doing so, a novelist like Steinbeck can give great depth and richness to a variety of human experiences. They can create characters like Tom Joad, the hero of Grapes of Wrath. And that vividness, that richness that comes from imagination often is, again, a great conduit of truth in a way that those confined to what actually happened, sources, footnotes, non-fiction writers cannot communicate. And that's why Steinbeck's novels that focus on the fictional but in many ways true experiences of itinerant workers, the displaced, the impoverished, really do serve as documents of Depression-era America. Steinbeck didn't write about the wealthy. He wrote about the poor. He wrote about the immigrant. He wrote about the itinerant farmer. And not only do his novels offer us a great window into the Great Depression, they're part of a larger experience in American culture towards a focus on the working people of this nation. Frank Capra was an Italian-American film director who made a series of films in the late 30s and early 40s that are often cited to this day as exemplars of an American character, Americana. In fact, there's a word in the American English language, Capra-esque, that refers to the idea that Capra's films reflect a certain notion of what defines America. He made films in this period that also centered on the little guy. Part of this focus away from cities, the glamorous, the rich, the celebrities that so defined American culture in the 1920s, and towards small-town values, the little guy, laborers, what was imagined to be the common man. In 1939, Capra made a film called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington about a small-town idealist, Jefferson Smith, played by Jimmy Stewart, who's elected to the U.S. Senate. And he arrives at the U.S. Senate hoping to do good for his constituents, be a good and steady leader during this time of crisis. He believes in this idea of representative government and democracy. But when he arrives in the Senate, he finds evidence of illegality, malfeasance, and corruption. Other senators are stealing money. When he goes forward to reveal this corruption, those corrupt senators malign Jefferson Smith and make it look like he's the one guilty of stealing. And then he's about to be removed from the Senate as a result. And in the final scene of the film, one of the most famous scenes in Hollywood history, the Jefferson Smith character, about to be drummed out of the Senate in false charges of corruption, gives a speech, a filibuster speech, in defense of what he calls the lost causes the little guys, the farmers, the laborers, people who often don't have a voice. And this salute to the little guy, the lost causes, is so powerful. It melts the hearts of those senators, and they come forward and voluntarily reveal that they, not Jefferson Smith, are the true thieves and that he is innocent. Yeah, it's a little cornball, a little idealistic, but for audiences in 1939, it was welcomed as an example that, yeah, America sometimes loses its way. America faces moments of crisis, but in the end our system works, democracy works, and Americans wanted to believe that in a Great Depression where so much faith was placed in the hand of government to be a source of relief and hope. Frank Capra directed Meet John Doe, which is a really interesting movie to see now because it's really anticipatory of our modern media culture. It's about creating false heroes in an effort to sell newspapers in a way that we might see today to increase page views and clicks. The title, Meet John Doe, is the idea of the common man, and the film offers a critique of the way in which newspapers, the media of that age, distorted an image of the common man. It's an effort to create a true vision of the common man outside those distortions. And then Frank Capra, in 1946, would direct a film that still flickers across TV screens every Christmas season, It's a Wonderful Life, about a small-town banker who loses it all in the Great Depression. And early in the film, he's about to kill himself. He goes to a bridge, and he looks down at an icy river. He's about to kill himself because he reasons that he's worth more to his family dead than alive, because if he dies, they'll at least have his life insurance. And so he sees himself as worthless, better off dead than alive. And then, just before he's about to commit suicide, an angel, Clarence, appears. And for the rest of the film, Clarence shows him and us, the film audience, what life would have been like if George Bailey, character at the heart of this film, was never born. What's the message of It's a Wonderful Life? Everyone matters. Your life matters. What's the message of It's a Wonderful Life? Small towns. That's where you find real Americans. So Frank Capra made a series of movies. These themselves are artifacts of our consumer culture. Many of them would become huge box office draws, remarkably successful. One of the few industries that thrived in the Great Depression was Hollywood. For 10 cents, you could go and watch 2 movies and lose your troubles for a few hours. Americans flocked to the films of Frank Capra, and so they are themselves artifacts of a consumer culture, but they're also artifacts that reveal the broader spirit of America that sought to recalibrate its priorities away from cities, the rich, and towards small towns and the George Baileys of this world. Also in 1939, the year of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and its ode to democracy, the American system, and the efficacy of government, you had 2 other films that are classics, icons of American culture, not just film culture. Wizard of Oz, which is a scathing indictment of cities. Dorothy finds herself in a strange world, a colorful world, and she says, how do I get home? Everyone around her says, go to the city. Go to Emerald City. That's where you'll find the answers to every question you may have. And so she heads to the city. And along the way, she's attacked by flying monkeys and trees that throw apples at you, but she makes her way to the city, that place of promise, a place where all the questions you may have will be answered. But what does Dorothy find in the city? Lies, deception. The great Oz is a great fraud. And thus, confronted with the lies of the city, Dorothy says, looking into the camera and into the hearts of moviegoers everywhere, if I ever go looking for my heart's content again, I'll look no further than my own backyard, stating that the place where one's dreams are realized are there on the farm in Kansas. The city is a place of lies, deception. Where do good people lie? Where does the heart of America find itself? In the farms, in Kansas, in the heartland. Wizard of Oz is a scathing indictment of cities and resonated. In the 1930s America, Depression-era America, that was urged to look away from the bustling cities and to the heartland, to the experiences of farmers and laborers as definitive of indeed our heart's content. Also in 1939 you have Gone with the Wind. Now, Gone with the Wind is extremely problematic, troubling, corrosive in terms of its impact in distorting our understanding of slavery, the Civil War, and the antebellum South. But another way to read Gone with the Wind, not only as a terrible, tragic expression that leads to a very unreal, false understanding of slavery, is as a Depression-era document, an element of Depression-era consumer culture, because, yeah, it's set during the Civil War, but it's really a narrative of deprivation. At one point in the film, the main character says to us in the audience, "As God is my witness, I shall never go hungry again." Well, Americans had gone hungry in 1939. They knew what deprivation was, and they wanted to believe in again a renaissance, a rebirth. In centering the narrative on the Civil War, it was a way of telling Americans during one crisis that we had lived through previous crises and survived. So, Gone with the Wind, not a good window into slavery, antebellum America, and the Civil War, instead a false vision of those eras, but perhaps a good window into the year of its release, 1939. What we have here in this slide is a number of examples of how in our consumer culture, in the consumer artifacts of that period, and in the broader culture, there's this recalibration of priorities away from the values of the 1920s that celebrated greed, individualism, materialism, big business, the city, and towards a different vision of what should define America. It's again very demonstrative of not just the culture of the Great Depression, but also this ebb and flow about culture. In a class on consumer culture, we're talking about identities, values, priorities, ideals. And in the New Deal, our priorities and ideals shifted towards the small towns, common people, folk culture. Let's conclude our look at the New Deal by speaking to the way in which it restored hope, what often can't be measured in statistics. Great Depression was a time where many Americans came to believe the American way, the American ideal, had turned out to be a lie, and many believed that we had lost our way irredeemably. Some began to entertain radical new notions. Into that comes Franklin Roosevelt, his New Deal, his messages of sacrifice, service. And though that service would be exclusionary and omit so many Americans, for the Americans who did receive benefits, it was a time to believe again. Again, we don't go communist in the 1930s. There are no bloody revolutions in the streets. We don't go fascist. Instead, thanks to the New Deal, we became more committed than to consumer capitalism ever before. We saw a government could work, could solve problems, and it put money in people's pockets. They could spend it, buoying and restoring an American dream defined through stuff. The New Deal targeted consumerism as the source of misery as people lost their jobs, their ability to spend. They felt a psychological trauma in being unable to support their families and lost their homes. And it was designed to shore up that hemorrhaging by allowing people to spend again and having the effects both economic and psychological. It seemed like by the late 30s, with those who did receive benefits, again, it's important to note that so many Americans remained excluded from the benefits of the New Deal based on race, but also regionality, as rural America continued to suffer mightily. But for those who did receive benefit, it looked like the good life was back at hand, thanks now to this interventionist role by the government and a collective sacrifice and service. But in the early 40s, a new crisis loomed, the second great crisis of the early 20th century, World War II. And we'll turn our attention to that crisis in our next lecture. And what we'll see is a continuity between these two crises, where the government becomes more involved in the economy. It's once again an era of a more regulatory interventionist approach. and further messages of sacrifice and service that often manifest and express themselves in, indeed, a consumer economy and consumer culture. If the history of modern American consumer culture is the history of America, that in looking at consumerism we can see the broader story, we have now seen that in regards to the first crisis of the Great Depression, and in our next lecture we'll see it in regards to another convulsive event of the early 20th century, World War II.